The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited for the trial to resume. Young Amara stood in the witness box, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small piece of paper. Her dark eyes were fixed on the ground, but something in the way she held herself told you she wasn't just a scared girl, she was something more, something far stronger than most people realized. Her lawyer, a well-respected but somewhat impatient woman named Leslie Gray, was trying to guide her through the questioning. "Amara," Leslie began, "tell the court exactly what happened on the day of the incident." Amara swallowed hard and began to speak, her voice soft at first but gaining strength with every word. She told them about the series of events that led up to the moment she had to act. But she never mentioned her dog. No, that was something only she knew. As she spoke, the attention in the room shifted, but not in the way one might expect. A sharp observer could see her eyes flicking towards her service dog, Duke, who was sitting quietly by her side. His posture was alert, but his gaze was calm. He had been trained for moments like this, moments when Amara would need him most. And then it happened. Without anyone noticing, Amara sent a subtle cue to Duke. It was the slightest movement of her finger, something so small it could have easily been mistaken for a nervous tic. But Duke knew exactly what to do. The tension in the room escalated. Something was about to unfold, and nobody could predict what it was. Amara's actions, hidden beneath the surface, had set something in motion. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Even the judge, who had maintained a neutral expression throughout the trial, seemed to sense a shift. The jurors shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing as they tried to process what was happening. It was as if a silent signal had passed through the room, unnoticed by most, but not by those who were paying close attention. Duke, the service dog, had risen to his feet, his ears perked. His movements were subtle but deliberate, and in a flash, he was moving towards the defendant's table. The quiet shuffle of his paws on the floor was the only sound breaking the stillness. A gasp rippled through the courtroom as the dog reached the edge of the defense table and, in one smooth motion, nudged a briefcase with his nose. The briefcase, which had been overlooked earlier, was now dangerously close to the judge's bench. The room was silent for a long moment, the unexpectedness of the moment hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Everyone turned to look at Amara, who still appeared outwardly calm. But her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, were locked on Duke. She had planned this all along. Leslie Gray, still in the middle of her line of questioning, stopped mid-sentence as she realized something was wrong. The courtroom had gone still, too still. Her gaze flicked between Amara and the dog, and she felt the weight of the moment begin to settle on her shoulders. Then, as if on cue, a sharp murmur rose from the crowd. It wasn't just the action of the dog, it was what came next. One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s named Joan, suddenly stood up, her face flushed with disbelief. I saw it," she stammered. Everyone turned toward her. The room was heavy with anticipation, as if the air had thickened, and the very walls were holding their breath. Joan's voice shook as she tried to explain, her hand trembling as she pointed towards Amara. I saw the girl give him the cue. She made a movement. A signal. Her eyes were wide, frantic even, as if she couldn't believe what she was saying herself. The room fell into chaos. The judge, clearly startled, slammed his gavel down with a force that echoed through the courtroom. Order! Order in the court, he bellowed, but his voice barely cut through the rising tension. Amara stood frozen in the witness box, her eyes not leaving Joan. There was no fear in her gaze, no surprise, only the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what was happening. Leslie Gray, momentarily flustered, shot a quick glance at the defense attorney, who was equally stunned. Neither had expected this. The whole case had been about an incident that had escalated quickly, and now, suddenly, it was veering into something completely uncharted. Your Honor, Leslie began, regaining some composure, this is completely inappropriate. The witness is, let her speak, the judge interrupted sharply, his voice low but commanding. He had no choice now but to hear what Joan had to say, whether it made sense or not. Joan took a deep breath and continued, it was a sign. I don't know what it meant, but the dog, it responded to it. It was as if Amara controlled him, like he was part of some plan. Amara's lips curled ever so slightly. A small, nearly imperceptible smile. Duke, still sitting by the defendant's table, raised his head and looked at Joan, his eyes locked on hers. There was something unnerving about the calmness of his gaze. The dog wasn't just a pet, he was a part of something far bigger, something that no one in the courtroom could yet understand. The room was on edge, the murmurs growing louder. But Duke stayed calm, as if he was aware that all eyes were on him. His very presence was unsettling, yet magnetic. And that's when the unexpected happened. The unexpected event that followed was something no one could have predicted. As Joan's voice echoed through the courtroom, and the tension reached its peak, Duke suddenly began to move again, but this time, it wasn't towards the briefcase. It was directly towards the prosecutor's table. The room fell silent once more. It was as if the dog was in a trance, moving with purpose, his eyes fixed ahead. But what was even more startling was the way Amara's gaze never wavered from him, her expression calm, almost serene. She had orchestrated this was part of the plan. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features named Robert Peterson, stood frozen as Duke approached him. The dog's movements were fluid and sure, and with one swift motion, Duke nudged a stack of documents off Peterson's desk. The papers fluttered to the floor in a chaotic mess, but it wasn't the mess that had the room on edge. It was the precise moment when the documents scattered, revealing one single piece of paper in the middle of the floor. It was a piece of evidence. Something crucial. And it had been hidden. The judge's gavel slammed again, but it was no longer about restoring order, it was about making sense of what had just happened. What is this? He demanded, his voice now tinged with frustration. Leslie stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She bent down to pick up the paper, her fingers trembling as she examined it. Her eyes widened in shock. This wasn't in the case files, she said slowly, looking at the prosecutor. This was never submitted as evidence. The room fell into an eerie silence, and the prosecutor's face drained of color. That's impossible, he muttered. We reviewed everything. But Amara's lips quirked into that small, knowing smile once more. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. Her plan, whatever it was, had taken shape in front of everyone's eyes. The dog had given them the clue they hadn't known they were looking for. And with that small gesture, the courtroom now stood on the brink of unraveling everything they thought they knew. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. All eyes were fixed on Amara, but she remained utterly composed, her expression unreadable. Her gaze flicked briefly to Duke, who was still standing calmly beside her, as if he were a mere bystander in the unfolding drama. Leslie Gray took a step back, holding the piece of paper up for everyone to see. This changes everything, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hushed whispers that filled the room. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was now visibly sweating, his usual composure cracked. What exactly is this? The judge demanded, his voice sharp as he addressed both the defense and the prosecution. How did this piece of evidence come to be here? The prosecutor's hands were shaking as he reached for the paper, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. I don't know, he stammered. It wasn't in the original files. We checked every single document before the trial. This doesn't make sense. Leslie's eyes narrowed. You're telling me that this was never submitted? That this crucial evidence, one that could have changed the entire outcome of the case, was missing? The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Everyone could feel the ground shifting beneath them. What they had thought was a clear-cut case was now teetering on the edge of collapse. And Amara, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, was still the center of it all. Duke turned his head and looked up at her. Amara didn't respond verbally, but the flick of her finger, subtle as ever, was all it took. The dog's posture remained relaxed, but there was an undeniable intelligence in his eyes, a recognition of the part he had played in all this. Joan, still standing in the back of the room, clutched her chest as she tried to catch her breath. This is not just about a missing document," she whispered. This is a game changer. She's been controlling everything from the start." A murmur swept through the jury as the weight of her words settled over them. What had started as a simple trial had now turned into something much more complex, and nobody in the room was quite sure how to respond. But Amara remained calm, as if she were simply waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Duke's eyes never left her, his silent loyalty and unspoken understanding a testament to the bond they shared. They had planned this moment, and now the court was left to pick up the pieces. The courtroom had descended into an unsettling kind of chaos. Whispers and murmurs swirled through the air, but they were quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The atmosphere was thick with disbelief, confusion, and an underlying sense of dread. Everyone was trying to piece together what had just happened, but the picture wasn't clear. The prosecutor, Robert Peterson, was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He glanced at the piece of paper in his hand, then at Amara, who still stood unmoving in the witness box, as if the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. It was hard to tell whether he was angry, terrified, or both. But one thing was certain, he had underestimated her, and now the consequences were unfolding in front of everyone. Leslie Gray, though stunned, quickly regained her focus. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but urgent, "it's clear that this is no accident. This evidence wasn't misplaced. Someone deliberately hid it, and I believe we have a witness who can explain why." The judge, now clearly on edge, turned his gaze toward Amara. "You, young lady, have been unusually calm throughout this entire proceeding. Perhaps too calm. I need you to explain what's going on here." Amara didn't flinch. Her silence spoke louder than words, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet resolve, as if this moment had been building up for far longer than anyone realized. She knew exactly what to do next. Then, without a single word, Amara subtly nodded towards Duke. The dog, who had been sitting quietly by her side, seemed to understand the unspoken command. In one smooth, fluid motion, Duke padded toward the judge's bench. His eyes never left Amara as he moved, a silent assurance that this was part of their plan. The courtroom held its breath. Duke reached the bench and, with precision, gently nudged a hidden compartment beneath the judge's desk. There was a soft click, and the compartment slowly opened, revealing a small, locked box. The room gasped. "Unbelievable," Joan whispered from the back, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The judge stared at the box, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. He opened it, revealing a set of documents that no one had known existed. Papers detailing a hidden conspiracy, confidential information that tied key figures to corruption, and, more importantly, evidence that completely undermined the entire case against Amara. The prosecutor stumbled backward, his face drained of color. This can't be real," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting from the judge to Amara, and back again. "How could this have been kept from us?" Leslie turned to face him. "I think the real question here is, who's been keeping secrets?" Amara's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, but it wasn't a smile of victory, it was a smile of knowing. She had orchestrated every step of this, each move carefully planned, each gesture timed to perfection. The courtroom, once a place of structured order, was now on the verge of unraveling completely. Duke returned to Amara's side, sitting down once more, as if this was all just another day's work. But for everyone else in the room, nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was in a state of absolute chaos. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture that was forming was one no one had expected. The air crackled with tension, and for the first time since the trial began, the judge looked uncertain, even shaken. Amara, however, was unmoved. She remained silent, her gaze steady and unflinching as she surveyed the reactions unfolding before her. The power she held in this moment wasn't in her words, it was in the control she had over the situation, and she wasn't about to give it up now. The judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. Enough. This court will be adjourned for the moment. We need time to process these revelations. There was no protest. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the gavel fell, signaling the temporary end to the day's proceedings. But it wasn't the end of the trial, it was the beginning of something much bigger. As people began to file out of the courtroom, the murmurs of disbelief grew louder. Whispers about what had just transpired filled the hallways, with people speculating about Amara's role in uncovering the truth. Some seemed awed by her calm, while others were afraid of what this might mean. There were more questions than answers, and the more they thought about it, the less they understood. Amara stood, slowly turning to walk towards the door, Duke at her side. The dog's steps were measured and deliberate, his eyes never straying from her. He was her companion, her confidant, more than a service dog. He was part of a plan, a well-executed, carefully calculated series of events that had begun long before anyone realized. Leslie followed closely behind, a mix of admiration and unease in her eyes. She'd known Amara was capable, but this was beyond what she could have imagined. What now? She asked quietly, her voice filled with both awe and apprehension. Amara paused before answering, her voice low but resolute. Now we wait. The truth has been exposed, but they won't let it go without a fight. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The room might have been empty now, but the war was far from over. What had started as a courtroom drama had now evolved into something far larger, something that would change everything for Amara, for Duke, and for everyone who had been part of this case. The truth had a way of coming to light, but not without consequences. And Amara was ready to face whatever came next. The following days felt like a fever dream. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, and within hours, the trial had become national news. The footage of Amara and Duke in the courtroom was replayed endlessly, and every single detail was scrutinized, dissected, and analyzed. The courtroom had witnessed an unprecedented turn of events, and now the world wanted answers. Amara and Leslie sat together in a quiet cafe, away from the madness. The air between them was thick with the weight of what had happened. The case was far from over, but Amara had won the first battle. The public now saw her differently, no longer just a young girl in a witness box, but someone with power, someone who had outsmarted the system. So, what happens now? Leslie asked, sipping her coffee, her gaze fixed on Amara. Do you think they'll come after you? After Duke? Amara's eyes were focused on the window, watching the world go by. They already are, she said quietly. The truth's dangerous, and people don't like it when it's exposed. But that doesn't matter. It's too late now. Duke lay quietly at Amara's feet, his head resting on his paws. To anyone else, he was just a service dog. But to Amara, he was something far more than that. He had been her ally, her protector, and now, in a strange twist of fate, he was the key to a truth that no one had expected. The room seemed to breathe around them, the quiet hum of distant conversations blending into the background. Outside, the world was still spinning, unaware of how drastically things had changed. But Amara knew. She had set the stage, and now the pieces were all falling into place. The prosecutor, Robert Peterson, had been removed from the case after a series of damning revelations about his involvement in covering up critical evidence. The judge, once calm and composed, had been placed under investigation for his connections to powerful figures in the legal system. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed. But it wasn't just the legal system that was being shaken to its core. The people who had underestimated Amara, the ones who had seen her as just a vulnerable girl, were starting to realize they had made a grave mistake. They thought they controlled the narrative, but Amara had rewritten the script. She had taken control, and now, there was no turning back. Leslie looked at Amara, her expression a mix of admiration and uncertainty. You've changed everything. The way people see you, the way they'll see this entire system, it's not going to be the same. Amara finally looked up, her eyes steady. No. It's not. And that's exactly how it should be. With a final glance at Duke, Amara stood and walked out of the cafe, Leslie following closely behind. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. And while the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear, Amara and Duke were no longer just part of the system, they were the ones who had torn it apart. The courtroom's reaction had been just the beginning. The world was now watching, and Amara was ready to face whatever came next, with Duke by her side. And so, the story ended, but the echoes of that courtroom moment would reverberate for years to come.